we're surrounded in our thinking by what I would call false dichotomies. Either we build a healthy, profitable business, or we take care of people. Either we build roads and bridges, or we take care of the planet. These are false choices.
Hey, this is Good Work Episode 3. My name is Barrett Brooks. I'm your host and the creator of this show, which is made up of long-form interviews with talented people using their careers to make the world a better place. Today's guest is someone really special to me. His name is Jerry Colonna. Reboot's director of coaching, Andy Christinger, was my executive coach for over 5 years as I was leading ConvertKit, which is a creator economy software startup, from about $3 million in annual revenue to just under $30 million in annual revenue. He helped me tackle all of the challenges that I went through in growing that company, as well as my transition out of my role and transition eventually into coaching over the course of 2 years. Jerry is the CEO of that organization. He's also the author of 2 books by the name Reboot and Reunion. Reboot's tagline is leadership in the art of growing up, and Reunion's tagline is leadership in the longing to belong. Both of those concepts are really near and dear to my heart, both growing up, doing the inner work necessary to become the leader we're capable of, and also the desire to belong, to build communities, to be part of communities where we're wanted, where we're appreciated, where we're respected. Both of those books hit me in my career at the perfect time. I found that I grew immensely by reading both of them because they're deeply personal. They're about topics that matter to me. And Jerry's the person who wrote them. So I got to have an incredible conversation with Jerry that I think you're going to love. Before we dive right in, I do want to give you a quick heads up. We talk very honestly and in a raw way about the topic of suicide and mental health in this episode. So if that's something that doesn't work for you right now, that you don't feel like you have the capacity for, I want you to know that ahead of time. You don't have to tune into the episode at all, but I also want you to know if you want to listen to everything but that, I'm going to record a short kind of trigger warning or heads up that'll come before the topic of suicide so that you can skip that part if you don't want to hear it. I want to be really respectful of everyone. I think there's a lot of value of talking about these things. And I know that at the wrong time for the wrong person, it can be really harmful. I think Jerry fully delivered on who I know him to be, both as a coach and as a person. And I think any leader will take a lot away from this episode. So I hope you enjoy, and let's get to it. Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Barrett. It's good to see you.
It's so good to see you too. I was just joking with you beforehand that I think we've gone back and forth over and over, but we've never actually gotten to spend one-on-one time together. So it's a real joy. I'm a longtime client of Reboot's. Your director of coaching, Andy Christinger, has probably been one of the most important people in my life over the past 5 years. So I'm well-versed in the Reboot ways, and I thought that might be an appropriate place to start, or give us an appropriate place to start, by asking you how you're doing and kicking off with the little red, yellow, green.
Good. Well, I'm green, which means I'm really good to go and feeling calm and focused, with a little streak of yellow because my daughter is flying today. She's actually coming to Colorado from Tennessee. And I am tracking the weather like a good dad would.
I love it. I love it. We've got some weather blowing in here too. I would say that I'm green today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I've got a hint of yellow as well. Our son has been having night terrors or something like that. And so we've had a couple nights this week that weren't quite as much sleep as I was hoping. But overall, I would say that I'm green, and I'm excited about kind of where I'm at and how I'm entering this conversation. I got, I would say, a 50% morning routine in before we hopped on today. So it feels like this is a part of my morning routine for the day, which feels really good. I kick off with that exercise because it's been such a core leadership practice for me since I learned it from Andy. We used it at a company I was at for 5 years as COO. And I've used it in every organization I've been to since then, even the ones that at first kind of reject it. And so I wondered if you might just kind of tell us where that comes from and why kicking off in that way can be such a powerful way to connect and start things when you're gathering with people.
I first actually encountered that at a boot camp that predated the establishment of Reboot, so 11 years ago. One of the co-facilitators of an early boot camp that we did, and boot camp is our term for these multi-day immersive retreat kinds of experiences. That facilitator learned the technique from a therapist of his and learned to identify his internal state as a way to help him manage, despite some difficulties, mental health issues that he had. We started using that first in the boot camps, and then it became a core principle of how we sort of think about things. And I very quickly started thinking about it, well, as a way of, you're familiar with the term that I coined 15 years ago, which is radical self-inquiry, as a almost mindfulness practice of being aware of how you are. After that, we came to understand that it has its roots in what's called polyvagal theory. And so there's actually a science behind using the conscious mind to identify what's happening at the vagus nerve level. It's like, what am I feeling in this moment? As you know, it's quite a interesting way of establishing a rapport, an emotional rapport, either in a group setting or in a dyad setting, or even, I argue, how we are with ourselves. I don't use red, yellow, green when I'm journaling, but I've been journaling since I was 13 years old. And the first statement in every journal entry is, how am I doing in that moment?
You know, I've heard you talk so much about journaling as a practice, and it gets at this first of these two big questions that I interpreted as what you were asking in your two books. Who am I? And then the whose am I? Both books have hit me at times in my life when I was ready for them. I just felt very lucky to be at the exact point in my life when I was ready to receive them and appreciate them and grow from them. But the journaling thing and learning to look inward, I've learned is an uncommon practice. First of all, we don't value it inherently in society, I don't think.
Which is why I refer to it as radical.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's, I wish it weren't, but I think it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought we might actually begin there, the who are you? And I want to explore it from two angles. I thought I'd ask you who you are. I mean, everyone, well, maybe not everyone. Everyone will know by now because I've introed you your accomplishments and what you've done in the world. But I wonder from where you sit today, who you are and what that answer has become for you over time.
I think that one of the best ways to understand who I am, or more specifically, to understand how I perceive who I am, because of course there's that, goes back to a story which you're probably familiar with because I wrote about it in my first book, Reboot. About 14 years ago, I went on a vision quest in the desert of Utah, and the retreat guide for that is actually one of our partners here at Reboot, Jim Marsden. And as part of that 14-day experience, which included a 4-day water-only solo time in the desert, I was instructed to listen closely to hear what may be occurring, which is a very vague instruction. And I had set up my shelter. It wasn't even a tent. It was just a tarp next to this old ponderosa pine tree. And every time I passed the ponderosa pine tree, I would hear this word, holder. As I sat with that, and there were no drugs involved, there were no mushrooms, there was no psychedelics, it was just the effects of solitude and fasting. What that evolved into was an identity that I still hold today, and that is holder of stories of the heart. And when I think about who I am in the world and what is my gift, my responsibility, it is to hold stories of the heart.
It's really beautiful. I started working with Reboot when I was an executive in the startup world. I was really grateful to have brought your team in to help all of our executives work together better and learn how to inquire within. And since then, I have become an executive coach myself. And so that's what I do now for work. As part of that, I got on this kick of listening to all of the early Reboot podcast episodes. I went through like the whole back catalog, basically.
So I've been living in your head for
that's right,
a while.
Right. And I'm familiar with that in the reverse, where, when you're on a podcast, people really get to know you. They grow a perception of who you are over time. They begin to piece together parts of your story and your voice. And one of the things that I just noticed as I was listening was how artful you are at allowing people the space to create their stories and to feel the emotion of those stories. I mean, really, one of the best things I learned from you in just observing your coaching in those early episodes was your ability to pause with someone else's emotion and let them feel it, which is such the opposite of, I think, our natural inclination, which is to kind of run away from it or to make it feel better or fix it. That has been by far the most powerful thing I do for my clients now. And it's that holding, it's observing your ability to hold and seeing how powerful it is. And, you always make this joke on many of your interviews that you're labeled as this person who makes people cry. And you'll always say, I don't make people cry. Just give them the space to feel what they're feeling.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, first of all, thank you for noticing that. And I can say a few words about that. The first is that, as you've probably come to see in your own practice, that when you create space for the other person, more often than not, the emotion that rises is a sadness. And I have come to understand that the sadness is tinged with relief because we live in a world that's acculturated to turning people into problems, turning emotional states into problems, things that need to be changed. There are two roots of that in my own being. One stems from being a student of Buddhism now for almost 30 years. At its core, Buddhism is about the alleviation of suffering. And one of the things about the way we are, one of the ways in which what I do, what we do, might be considered radical, it's this odd state, Barrett, where I often describe myself as a first responder to suffering. The difference is we are not acculturated to know how to respond to suffering. I remember early on in the establishment of our boot camps, it was a tough rule to try to enforce. Eventually, we ended up letting it go. But I used to say to people when we were sitting in circle, when someone might be overwhelmed by emotion and tears might flow, it was really hard to try to get people to not leap across the room and shove a tissue in their hands. And in fact, I remember one time someone saying to me I was being cruel. What I had to say was, let the snots flow. And it comes from a good place. It really does. We are so trained to put out the emotion that we cut off the person's ability to process the emotion. We're so quick to jump in with words of comfort that we disrupt grief. We disrupt the fullness of the experience. Now, I said that it comes from two different practices. And here's a cheat sheet for understanding how Jerry is as a coach. So I was trained as a coach, and some of the things we're talking about right now were in the training program, but a lot of what we're talking about was not. So the Buddhist approach to how to be with suffering was not. But the other experience that my wife Allie and I were just talking about just the other day, the thing that is probably a greater influence on my coaching than I've talked about before is I have spent almost 30 years in, at first weekly, now bi-weekly, psychoanalytic group. I sit, at times it's been up to 7 people, now it's 6, with mostly psychoanalysts. And one of the most profound experiences in being in that group is learning to work with your own feelings as the person with whom you're holding space is going through their own feelings. And so if you really want to understand what I'm doing as a coach, whether by listening to the podcast or actually being coached by me, there is, as I often say, there's always one eye on the client and one eye internally. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I started working with a client the other day. We were talking about a dichotomy in her experience as a CEO, where most of the people are, and this was her phrase, ride or die with her, profoundly loyal to her, except that there were two people that she's not really sure she can trust. And I said, in a very classic psychoanalytic move, wow, I want to come work for you. I want to ride or die with you. How are you inducing that sense of loyalty in me? And what would it be like as a leader if you were not surrounded by people who were ride or die loyal to her? And the self-awareness that flowed just from that question was profound. I could not have done that, asked that question, if I just drew upon my training as a coach or drew upon my training as a Buddhist student. That comes directly from that other experience.
Being with psychoanalysts and learning
and psychoanalytic therapy for 36 years.
Yeah.
I still go to therapy twice a week.
One of the things I respect so much about the way you approach things and the way that Reboot as in general approaches things is you really don't ask of people work you haven't done yourself. And so you bring all of that to the table. You know, sometimes it's interesting, people will ask why some coaches cost so much money. And it's like, well, there's a lot of ways we could go about answering that. But one of the reasons I think is they can't get all of you any other way. You bring all of you to the table when someone gets to work with you, all of your experiences, all the retreats that you've done and the fasts and the training and the psychoanalysis and everything else. And that makes you uniquely valuable, you know, as a human being and as a coach. You probably can't really put a price on that that's accurate.
Well, I think what when one is looking to have a either therapeutic or coaching relationship, what you're really looking for is a depth of experience and a presence that, quite frankly, is not going to be replicated with AI.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, doesn't come about with 1 year's training in a program. Forgive me if I sound like the old man on on a park bench, but listen, whippersnapper, you're still becoming a coach, right? I'm still becoming a coach. I mean, I'm entering my 25th year as a coach. It takes time for a wine to develop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what you're paying for.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that you just said, talking about working with your client, is that idea of one eye inward and kind of one eye outward, metaphorically. And to me, that is a core leadership practice generally.
Mm-hmm.
It's what's going on for me and what's going on outside of me and how are those things related. And so often I think getting detached from what's going on in me is the thing that creates the pain in the relationship, because we start reacting, we follow our old patterns basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, we disconnect and we drop rapport and we become over intellectualized and the other person feels dropped. And by the way, let's extend this. This is a core leadership principle, but it's also a core adulting principle.
Yeah.
And might I say, as I enter my 60th year with 3 grown-ass adult children, it's a core parenting skill.
Yes. Yes. I cannot agree more with that.
And, the thing about parenting is we are evolutionarily wired to respond to the cries. And we are evolutionarily wired to make what is pain go away and perhaps wrap that munchkin in bubble wrap so they never feel pain again, which is a very difficult impulse to overcome, both as a parent, as a life partner, as a leader, or even as a coach.
we started with this question of who are you? Who am I? Who are we? Well, I want to read this quote, and then I want to share a little bit of my experience of trying to learn about myself as it relates to some of what we're talking about. So in the first book, Reboot, you define that radical self-inquiry. You say, radically inquiring within. I define it as the process by which self-deception becomes so skillfully and compassionately exposed that no mask can hide us anymore. The notion is to recognize that if things are not okay, if you're struggling, you stop pretending and allow yourself to get help. Well, number one, it's a beautiful definition. And I think it's exactly what, to your point, so many humans need, let alone leaders. The thing that I've learned as I've inquired within and tried to learn who I've become to this point is how much of a role understanding my own pain has played in that. Past pain, current pain, and learning to sit with it, sit with my own pain, let alone being with others. I also go to therapy and have for a long time. And this has come up in a few conversations I've heard you have, but internal family systems has been the methodology that's most been useful to me. In one session, I had this image of this never-ending well of water that had just been filling up all of my life with both my own pain and everyone around me. That somehow I felt it was my job to be the vessel for everyone else's pains around me and to neglect myself in favor of taking care of everyone.
What a good boy you were.
Exactly. That's how I got the praise and how I took care of myself, right? Mm-hmm. And it was like I had this big backlog of pain I needed to process. I needed to cry for all of the times I didn't cry throughout my life and grieve for all the times I didn't grieve. And only then could I kind of catch up to present day me and start experiencing pain as it happened. And it was so interesting because the first moment I felt like I was capable was when my dog of 14 years was ready to leave us. And that was this past summer. And I felt like I was fully present for grief as it was happening for the first time in my life. And it was paradoxically, it was one of the best experiences I've ever had because I could just be in it and cry as I needed to, not repress it and push it down and hide from it and run from it. And to me, so much of figuring out who we are is figuring out what causes pain over time. And I wonder how that hits you and if that feels true to you. Hey, it's Barrett. So I promised that I would give you a quick heads up before we got into the tough topic of suicide. If that's a topic that you don't think you can handle right now or that's just not good for your mental health, feel free to skip this part of the episode. This part of the conversation lasts about 3 minutes. So if you just want to skip ahead 3 minutes in your podcast player or on YouTube, you'll be beyond this part of the conversation that might be hard for you and into new topics that I think you'll find really meaningful and worthwhile.
It does feel true, and I have two memories that I would share in response to that. The first, and I've told this story often, but not this detail. When I had just turned 18, I was a freshman in college. On January 2nd, during the middle of winter break, I cut my wrists and tried to kill myself. And in some ways, it was the expression of 18 years of like you being a vessel for other people's pain. I ended up spending 3 months in a psychiatric hospital, first a horrific place called Creedmoor, which is, I think, now closed as part of the New York State system, and then a private hospital that my parents were able to get me into. After settling into the new hospital and settling into a routine, one of my sisters, my older sister Mary, gave me a greeting card. In it, she wrote about her feelings about the fact that I had been the kind of kid who was always a good boy. I was always presenting the best possible face, and that clearly had done a job of masking what was really going on inside of me. But I'll never forget the image on the card itself, which was the image of a little boy in a sailboat crying on a sea. And the line was, sometimes he felt that if he cried all the tears he needed to cry, that he would sail away forever on an ocean of tears. I am 60. That was 42 years ago. I still remember that card. The second memory is, you'd asked about, in a sense, or we talked about my quest. The second or third night, when the hunger pains had finally started to subside, which is what happens when you're fasting, I remember I had camped on a sandy bank of a small little creek, which was my source of water. And I remember doing a ritual in the sand. And at one point, I began digging into the sand. It was a really, really deep hole. And I started to vomit. And I vomited everything into that hole. I vomited my parents' pain, of which there was substantial. I vomited the pain of my childhood. I vomited the pain of everybody in my family. Things that, as an immature holder of stories of the heart, I was always holder. I just didn't know how to hold without being overwhelmed by their tears, by their pain, by their feelings. You know, when I think back now, how many years has it been? Oh, almost 30 since that time. No, almost 20 since that time. I think that the most important adulting skill I developed in my 40s was my ability to hold and be with someone else's pain without floating away on an ocean of tears.
It resonates very deeply with me. I think my age-old pattern was to hear it and adopt it as mine, as if it were mine. And that was everything from hearing that someone had acquired an illness and then worrying that I had that illness, or, you know, it manifested itself in all kinds of ways. So that really resonates with me. It's interesting because, so Andy, my coach, who's leads kind of coach development at Reboot, if I got that right, I kind of had a little bit of an unfair advantage in having him as my coach as I became a coach, because I felt like I got to benefit from all his resources and the things he knows. And so he recommended this training program called Presence-Based Coaching just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. BB Hansen's the principal now. And
it was developed by Doug Silsby.
Doug Silsby. And we had just an afternoon on the land as part of that program. I had an almost identical experience. I did not vomit everything, but I took a nap. I just felt the urge to take a nap next to the river. And I woke up and I had this uncontrollable urge to get these things out of my body. And I waded into the river and I washed myself of everything that all these pains, all these old things I had been hanging on to. And it was like I just had to push it out of me and shed it into the river, and just bawled my eyes out as I stood there and imagined every one of these old things I had been carrying floating away, being carried away down that river. It was the most euphoric feeling ever afterwards. There's this hill at the property called Hound Dog Hill, and there's a memorial to Doug Silsby, the founder, at the top. And so I walked from the river and walked up the hill. And as I rounded the corner of the hill, it was just this like majestic sunset over the valley of these North Carolina mountains. And I just started uncontrollably laughing and crying at the same time at just this unreal experience of letting go of all of these things and almost being able to see beauty in a way that I never had. That just hit me in this overwhelming sense of like joy, grief at the same time. And one of the beliefs that came out of that was that, or the way I've talked about it, is that the cost of joy is grief, that they can't exist without each other, that you have to be able to feel both in order to experience the upside of it. And I think for most of my life, I rejected that. I ran from it. I didn't want to be sad. I didn't want to be angry. I didn't want to be any of the scary things. I really believe that we have to transform our relationship to those negative, as they're, kind of perceived popularly. We have to change our relationship to those in order to become who we are.
Well, what I hear you saying, and it's a beautiful story, and God rest Doug's soul. I first encountered their work by reading Doug's book, The Mindful Coach, and have been recommending PBC, presence-based coaching, really ever since as a coach training program, because it's emphasis on presence, which is really what we've been talking about. I've been using the word holding, but we're really talking about presence. But what I hear you describing is what is the way to be with suffering? Well, the way to be with suffering is fully. The way to be with suffering is to be fully human with the whole megillah of that experience. And I agree with you that joy and grief are similar in that way. There's a section in Reboot, my first book, where I quote from the great Buddhist saint Milarepa, who talks about being unable to separate the clouds from the sky or the waves from the ocean. And that's what I think of when we talk about being with the fullness of the experience. There is no sky without the clouds. There is no ocean without the waves. That is the fullness of the human experience. And it's, in fact, the intense ways in which we try to push away the bad and focus only on the good that, in a sense, we create a subtle violence. Think of the way we do that in our relationship with the planet. Think about the way we do that, we were talking about being parents. Shh, don't cry. Or even worse, you want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about. We are effectively cutting off access to 50% of the human experience because we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that there's a cost to that. Obviously there's a cost to that. We pay it at the individual level, we pay it at the relational level, we pay it at the society level. My cost I was paying individually was perpetual anxiety. It was because I couldn't feel anger or sadness. I was just anxious always, looking out for the next danger. And everyone has their version of that.
Well, think of Terry Real's book, I Just Don't Want to Talk About It, which is about men's relationship to depression. Just the title, I Just Don't Want to Talk About It. We can hear so many people, mostly the males of the species, denying their experience. And yet, why is suicide and depression so rampant in men 35 to 60 years old?
Yeah.
Because I just don't want to talk about it.
There was this very poignant exchange in Reunion, the second book. And I want to shift here in a moment to talking about belonging and community and whose we are and our ancestors. But this quote hits right on what you were just talking about, which is, men of color, Carl explained to me, we don't talk like this, not in front of other men of color. And you responded, neither do white men. And of course, that's part of the problem. That's part of the wages of separation. The masks stayed down. Well, and you go on, the mask stayed down and the weight bearing down on each of us lifted a little as we shared stories of our lives. And you're talking about this experience of sitting in community with one another, with other men, and doing the opposite of what you just said. And creating spaces for that with male friends of mine has transformed my life. And I think theirs, because I don't feel the same loneliness when I know that I can connect with other men in my life in that way and share what's actually going on and realize that a lot of what's going on is normal. We just don't talk about it.
A lot of what's going on is human.
Yeah.
And then we don't talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good reframe.
Can I say a word or two about Carl and that?
Please.
In the context of that? So that's Carl Desser, who himself is a brilliant and wonderful coach. He identifies as a Black man. And Carl read Reboot, and I forget if it was recommended by a mutual friend or not, but we ended up in conversation. And he was he is part of a group of 6 men, all of whom are of color, and this old white guy, who we came together, some knew each other before, but we formed a circle. And since the summer of 2020, we meet a little bit less frequently than we once did, but we were with each other throughout most of the pandemic. And we dubbed ourselves the Warriors, after broken, open-hearted warriors. Each of those men responded differently to Reboot. And a few of them just reached out to me over social media. I mean, it's a strange experience for people to quote you at you. on social media. Yep, that's what I said. And what happened was we have had this profound relationship. Two of the men, Philippe Celestin and Marshall Pollard, who are brilliant creatives behind a group called Stay Dreamin'. They also are co-founders or co-directors of a school called the Creative School in DC, which teaches creative skills, podcasting, photography, film, to young, primarily Black queens and kings, mostly from the economically challenged parts of DC, many of whom have watched their friends be shot and killed. My experience with them, and you bringing Carl into this, is really an invitation for me to hold their stories and speak about the gift of who these humans are. It includes Ashanti Branch, whose work with the Ever Forward Club is all about teaching mostly young Black and brown, primarily boys, how to be with their feelings that they hide behind the mask. So God bless them all. They are fierce, broken, open-hearted warriors.
I feel so much compassion, and it's bringing up a deep well of energy in me to practice what we've been talking about and name it in our space together. I want to hear more about this idea or this term that you've kind of coined of broken, open-hearted warriors, and where that came from and what it means to you.
So it was Parker Palmer who shared with me. Parker Palmer is my mentor and teacher and guiding force in my life. He is in some ways one of the patron saints of Reboot. Parker shares this story of a young student coming to the rabbi and asking, "Rabbi, why do the words of the Torah say that? Why does the Talmud say we should place the words of the Torah upon our hearts? Why does it not say we should place the words of the Torah in our heart?" And the rabbi says, our hearts being as they are, hard as they are, the hearts need to break so that the words of the Torah may fall in. And that image of the necessity of the broken heart, or more specifically, the necessity of the broken open heart, I find intensely powerful, because it's a way of understanding, why do we struggle to mask? Why do we struggle to hold those masks up so that it takes compassion to drop the mask? We do that because we're afraid that the words of the Torah may fall into our hearts. See, we're not afraid of that so much, but we're afraid of the tears that may come. And so we mask up. In doing so, we prevent the words of the Lord from falling in. And that is a tragedy.
It is a tragedy. It relates directly to the core of your second book, Reunion. I was struck by, I've listened to and read a lot of your words, Jerry. So I was struck by the tone. The tone was different in this one.
Mm-hmm.
It was more forceful. I think you described it as angrier, strident. I think for good reason. There's so many issues that relate to what you talk in Reunion. And, for me, one of the ones that I'm most deeply passionate about is the climate and our planet and its health.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big part of what I hope to continue to influence in my own work. But there are many others. The racial dynamics in this country and around the world, the way we turn away from the least of these, as you talk about in the book. And I thought I wanted to share a story of mine as we get into this, and we'll take a pause here in a moment before our second half of our conversation. So I'm a Catholic. I know you have a Catholic background as well, and I converted to Catholicism when just before I married my wife. I grew up Methodist.
Was she Catholic?
She's Catholic, yeah. I don't talk about my faith much publicly, which is interesting to me in this moment, actually. I'm realizing I don't. And so anyways, I will hear.
Notice the feelings.
Yeah, it's the fear of judgment. It's the fear of being disregarded and dismissed.
There we go. Dismembered.
Mm-hmm.
from the
Dismembered. Yeah.
community.
Yeah. So I'm going to claim a piece of my wholeness and talk about it a little bit here for a second.
Amen.
And telling a story about brokenness, ironically. So I was sitting at a table. I was on there were two councils at the church we belong to here. Pastoral council, which is more about community and programming and all of that, and a finance council, which is about the business side of the church and addressing the real budgetary constraints and all of that. And I'm sitting in a finance council meeting, and the church has a school at it. So I live in Portland, Oregon, and we have a very challenging problem here, which is we don't have a way to house all of the people who need housing but don't have it. That means that people often live on the street. And many of those folks are challenged by other issues, mental health, drug addiction. And so near the church, which in my mind should be a sanctuary for folks like this, people camp out and sometimes use drugs because some of them have issues with drugs. And that means paraphernalia, needles, things like that end up around the church and the school. And that's a safety issue. To be sure, it's a safety issue for the children. We want to make sure we keep them safe. But this conversation, the entire conversation was about how to get rid of the homeless people around the church because of the safety issue. And I'm the youngest person in the room by some stretch, maybe at least 5 years, maybe 10. But I said, hey, can I just pause us for a moment? What are we here to do? What is our job here? Because we're talking as if we should be kicking these people out. And I wonder why we're not talking about how we can take them in. It feels broken to me. And to name, there's an ego piece to that, right? Of I am the kind of person who will say that kind of thing. And also the room went silent. The priest went silent. Every person around that table went silent. And they didn't know what to say. And some of that, I'm sure, was shame. Because of course, when you pause and you think about it, it's like, oh, right, we are sitting in a church. We do have resources and space here that we could be using. That story really came to mind for me as I read Reunion as an example of the dismemberment and the rejection and the challenges we face when we don't do our inner work, and certainly when we don't apply that to the world around us. So I wonder if you might share a little bit about what it means to you to belong and how that relates to the work we do in the world.
Well, that question is a larger question. So let me first respond to the story that you shared. Bless you for asking the question. Bless you for causing the silence and the silent reflection. Too many of us who hold power, and in that moment you were holding power, do not ask the tough question of themselves, because in that image, in that story, you didn't just ask the people around the table, you asked yourself that same question. Bring your attention back to how frequently you set up the story talking about the safety issue for children. And I want to bring your attention back to that because I don't want to induce shame. I want to connect with the fear, because that's what the statement, it's a safety issue for children, is an expression of.
Yeah.
Somehow there's an image that these children will be hurt. And it is not rooted in some fantasy. There is a fear there that is rooted in some realities. So I get that. When we are socialized to look away from the disinherited, as the theologian Howard Thurman coined the phrase in a powerful sermon called Jesus and the Disinherited, the tool that is used, not consciously, I don't think maliciously, although sometimes the fear of the other is weaponized, as we see in wars constantly. The tool that is used to turn away from suffering is fear. I'm going to turn away from the leper because I might get leprosy. Now, I evoke leprosy because it's such an evocative disease, so prevalent in the Bible. And it is a stand-in for the kind of leprosy, the way we treat mental illness, such as drug abuse and substance abuse. And you see what I did there. It's not mental illness and drug abuse. We treat it as if it's leprosy. We're afraid we're going to catch it, or we're afraid that our loved ones were going to catch it. And the irony is, the more we turn away from it, the greater the epidemic. Now, I'm not going to teach your priest Catholic theology. I am no theologian by any stretch of the imagination. I turned from Catholicism to, some might say, communism when I was a teenager. But I did evoke the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount in Reunion to come up with the phrase, the least of these, to describe who it is that we consistently, systemically other. Who is it that we push to the margins? The way we will, even as a kid, I would do this. I would wrinkle my nose at a homeless person on the subway in New York City because they smelled bad and not see the human being, not hold their story because I didn't know what to do with their suffering. The challenge of the unhoused is complex.
One of the most complex I think we have in society, yeah.
And yet, we do complex things all the time, dude. And it does feel like it's a problem of policy, not a problem of structures embedded in humanity. It does feel like a problem of priorities. It does feel like, what is the point of economic prosperity? What is the point of building, quote, the greatest nation on the face of the earth, if not to build a haven and a sanctuary for the least of these? Why do we exist if not to help our fellow people?
I want to pause there and take a break. I think it's a perfect question to pause on and contemplate for a moment. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about that question as it relates to the purpose of business and how we now use coaching as a tool to try and help address both the inner pain and growth and also the outer opportunity for building something better in the world. Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation, and while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about two things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator and growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. All right, Jerry, welcome back. I've got so many quotes here about business and the purpose of business and the people who lead. I laughed from a place of sadness and pain, really, when I read a thing that reminded me of something that makes me very sad. So you talk about this New Yorker cartoon in Reunion. It says, there's a stinging New Yorker cartoon that occasionally makes its way around as a meme. It stings because it's true. An adult sits at a campfire surrounded by a few kids. All are dressed in rags, signaling a dystopian future. The adult is speaking. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. That cartoon gets me every time because it reminds me of what really is at stake and the fact that we can argue about the purpose of business and the profit motive and everything else all day long, but it doesn't change the reality of what's going on in the world or how the earth responds to what we do to it. That idea captured in that cartoon is so much of what motivates me to try and create a different world of business that thinks of itself in a new way. I wonder how your ideas about the purpose of business have changed over time and what you see as the purpose of business from your seat now.
I think that my view of the purpose of business, on the one hand, has been consistent since I was a kid, since I was a young adult, as a young reporter, working for Technology Magazine, for example. I remember doing a special series on a company called Control Data Corporation, which had gotten into trouble with Wall Street because of its social responsibility policies, for example, and which is very reminiscent right now of so many people calling into question commitments to ESG. And to give you an example, there was a guy named Norbert, I'm forgetting his last name, who was vice chair of the company. And I remember interviewing him, and I was asking him why, and there were two particular things, plants that they had done. They had established plants in a socioeconomically challenged area of St. Paul, and another one in Brooklyn, where I grew up. Actually, in East New York, not far from where I grew up. And I remember asking him, why did they put a disk drive manufacturing facility in East New York, Brooklyn? And he told the story of listening to, I think it was the chair of the Urban League, after riots in Newark and LA, who said something to the effect, you can't do business in a community that's burning. I was 20 when I heard that. And here we are. Fast forward, Siberia is burning. Last summer, Canada was burning.
Yeah, a disturbing percentage of it.
A disturbing percentage. And that percentage is only going to increase, not decrease over time. Barrett, before we started recording, you mentioned your son. How old is your son?
So my two sons right now are 4 and 18 months. Everett and Paxton.
So let's hold them in our hearts. And let's talk about the human equivalent of Canada burning. Just a few weeks, maybe a few days after the horrific attacks by Hamas on Israel, a 6-year-old boy was stabbed to death because he is a Palestinian American. A 6-year-old boy was stabbed to death. There's a chapter in Reunion called The Wages of Separation, in which I try to describe what this worldview is costing us. And the first line that I wrote in the first draft of that chapter, which ended up being edited out because it would have located it too closely in a time and a place. But the spirit is still there. And the first line was, they have not yet finished burying the babies in Uvalde, Texas. I cannot describe with more stridency and even anger than to say babies are dying because we do not know how to create a sense of belonging in the world. A persistent, consistent sense of systemic belonging. And so how have my views evolved? On the one hand, it's been a consistent theme. You cannot do business in a community that's burning. But on the other hand, the stridency has actually increased because for one brief shining moment, we created enormous shareholder value at the behest of a 6-year-old Palestinian American boy.
Yeah, as stand-in for a million others.
as a stand-in for daily death and destruction.
I don't hold that lightly. And I think a lot about the models we hold up for business leaders, for CEOs, for the people that you work with, for the people that I work with. And on some level, I think we have a lack of imagination in who we hold up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we hold up the unicorn founders and the billionaires, and I don't have an inherent problem with that. I think it's great if you can build something that touches that many people. But, you know, if I were building kind of my Mount Rushmore of patron saints who have influenced my thinking, you know, Yvon Chouinard would be up there,
Mm-hmm.
the founder of Patagonia, and the people who have built that company into something different. And the way that he talks about business and uses his platform to, I think, be a different kind of role model. I hope to have him on the show one day to talk about different ways business can be in the way that they operate and the way that we think about ourselves. You know, you've got this this concept that I always appreciate it, which is the role of the CEO, the job of the CEO. And you always talked about, I think, three things. I wonder if you might talk about, I think that's grown a little bit as you've written the second book as well, but I wonder if you might just talk about the jobs of the CEO in all of this.
Sure. Simplistically put, and I still think this is true, the job is to hold and embody the vision, which includes the values, to build and maintain a great team, and to give them the resources they need to succeed. That is, I think, the consistent work that goes on. But why did that come to your mind right now?
Well, I suppose I have an unstated belief in this conversation, which is that we need courageous leaders to build a pathway to something different. And I think that business under the right leadership can be an incredibly powerful force for good, but we have to think of it that way. And so when I think about this conversation we're having and holding up Yvon Chouinard or, you know, any number of Jacqueline Novogratz, I could go on and on of the kinds of people I imagine as great role models.
The founder of Chobani.
Yeah. I want to bring that home for the people leading today, because what I hope is that everyone listening to this either is or will be either a founder or a member of a team where they bring this mindset to their work. And so the role of a CEO is partly, as you talk about in Reunion, one of the resources people need is belonging.
Mm-hmm. That's right. What you just did there was exactly where I was hoping you would go. The subtitle of Reunion is Leadership and the Longing to Belong. It was to realize that answering the universal longing to belong is a resource, is a way that furthers the establishment of an effective container. See, one of the challenges, Barrett, is that, and Buddhism has helped me see this clearly, we are surrounded in our thinking by what I would call false dichotomies. Either we build a healthy, profitable business, or we take care of people. Either we build roads and bridges, or we take care of the planet. These are false choices.
Yeah. Can I offer the concept of a polarity here as an alternative?
Sure. I mean, we can talk about it as a polarity, but even that I'm a little suspicious and skeptical of, because while embracing polarity is an incredibly important adulting tool, they are not polar opposites. They don't sit on the opposite ends of a spectrum. They are in service to each other. Is the tail end of a coin in service or in opposition to the heads up end of the coin? Of course not. Parker teaches in one of his books, it's actually a Mobius strip where the inner and the outer work together. There is no inner and there is no outer. They are both the same. And in the same regard, we can actually build organizations that are fiscally responsible, that are profitable, where profit is used to maintain the organization so that people can pay their bills, pay their mortgages, send their children to school, do the things that life would have them do without destroying themselves, destroying the planet, destroying each other. See, the challenge is the human tendency to polar opposites. As I often joke with my own clients, you can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, I love it when you say that. You say that on a lot of your interviews. And, it's like we can create belonging and be profitable. And in fact, it might be the best way.
It is certainly the most sustained, or it's the path to the most sustained and persistent organizational strength.
Yeah, I want to speak to that because I spent years as a COO where I felt my role primarily was to create belonging. It was to foster a community of people who were safe enough to challenge themselves to do the best work of their lives, to figure out what they were capable of together. I sat in my old patterns in that role where I took on the burdens of everyone down the org chart and tried to advocate for them up the org chart to the one person above me. And I burned myself out. I did it at the cost of myself. I believe, looking back, it has to come from the leader. It must come from the leader for it to really exist fully in the organization. So, you asked me, how did I come to this question about what's the role of the CEO? And I think the reason is I really want to bring home for people how important it is, first of all, to do your inner work, which is what Reboot's about. And then secondly, to bring that awareness and empathy that you gain from that to the people on your team so that they can feel safe enough to do the work you wish they would do or that you think they're capable of doing. And so often the opposite is how we do it. Those of us who have lineages rife with famine and deprivation are particularly susceptible to doubting our worthiness. Part of the great myth of business leadership is that the power of never enough can be channeled and mastered into drive and motivation, traits so often seen as sacred to the pursuit of a goal. The myth is that we can cherry pick the good, known as motivation, while leaving behind the devastating negative of not good enough. And you go on to share a story about one leader you were coaching who was kind of like white knuckling her way through leadership, the never enoughness that was being inflicted on the team, and that there was this sense of we can never do enough. And as I read that story, I had a new understanding of my experience, that I was carrying in me a sense that I could never be enough at the time and projecting that onto my partner in that business. He may or may not have had a role in that and taking advantage of that and using it for motivation for me. But inside of me, I didn't think I could ever be enough. And I guarantee, despite everything I was trying to do to create belonging, that was showing up in that organization.
Well, that's the shadow side. So first of all, that quote's from Reunion. And I'll bring your attention back. Well, first of all, there's two parts to that. One is that persistent sense of never enough. And what you're highlighting in your own experience is, you described it before as anxiety. Can you see the relationship between the persistent anxiety stemming in part from not knowing how to process your own uncomfortable feelings, but also perhaps an inherited sense of not good enough, never enough? Those two things coming together can create some positive momentum, but oftentimes have a dark side to it, which activates someone else's sense of never enough. And it's all masked under this notion of urgency, which can be so destructive within an organization. So, and you did something very skillful there. You use radical self-inquiry to make the connection between your own childhood. Let me take you a little bit deeper. Who in your ancestral lineage might have carried that same sense of never enoughness? And in what ways did it serve them?
It's a beautiful question. I'm thankful to have done a lot of early research on my lineage so that I could receive the messages of the book, and this being one of them. So I'll answer it. I think there's multiple paths that comes to me, or that I come by it honestly. One is I only have to go back to my great-grandparents to find the people who came across the southern border and made a life here in San Antonio, Texas. Over 2 generations, their family made themselves white to belong. And I'm now in the process of trying to reclaim so much of that Mexican heritage and understand it in the absence of great teachers because we rejected it as a family. So that's one place I think it comes from. And then the other is on my dad's side, which I think probably comes more from being poor. My grandfather on that side was one of a large group of kids. I actually don't know how many, 8 or 9 or something like that. He, at his peak of his career, was the manager of a lumber mill, or one shift of a lumber mill, I should say. And my grandmother was perpetually angry at him for a life that she felt like she deserved but didn't have. And that resulted in alcoholism on his part and just a complete detachment from his life, I think. And I think that that lives on through my dad. I think he's lived a very sad life in which he's felt not enough for a lot of it. And so I've had to see the ways in which I think I blended with my dad, and also the ways in which my immigrant ancestors had to reject parts of them in order to make it.
So do you see the longing to belong in all of them?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those who crossed the southern border, what were they leaving behind? What were they moving towards? The safety of whiteness, the sense of deprivation that perhaps your grandmother felt, and the trigger that it brought out in your grandfather, such that his own inadequacy might have been given expression in his seeking solace in alcoholism. God bless you, dude. I mean, this is exactly why I wrote this book. What you just shared is exactly why I wrote this book. This is why Reunion, it's not necessary to read Reboot to understand Reunion, but why it's a continuation of the work of Reboot. Because what you just did there in a very sophisticated way was make the connection between your propensity for never enoughness might have been toxic. Okay, you did that work. You come to understand that you have to do some internal work around quieting that crow, to use the metaphor from Reboot, that says you're never enough. But then you did the more sophisticated work of saying, well, where did this voice come from? And how might it have served my ancestors? And how might I understand the fullness of who they were? Now let's take it all the way back. There you are back at that council at your church, thinking about the unhoused folks. Where did your immigrant ancestors live when they first made it to San Antonio?
I can only imagine, this is one of the areas where I have to do Embrace Your Invitation to Imagine in the book.
I mean, just hold that view.
Yeah.
Who were Jesus? Who were Mary and Joseph? But unhoused migrants. Unhoused migrants. Now, I don't know that that's what in fact happened to your ancestors.
Sure.
But what would cause them to cross the border? It wasn't, I guarantee you, it wasn't because they were having a grand old time.
I mean, I think about it in two ways. I think there's often, pain, some kind of pain that they were going through, and a hope that they might be able to find a place where their children and grandchildren wouldn't have to experience the same pain.
They did it for you.
Yeah. Yeah, so that I could have this conversation right here.
They moved towards whiteness. They moved to dismember parts of themselves so that your children could belong.
Yeah, and my children only have to go back to their mom. Their mom moved from Singapore when she was 8. I'll leave it at that because that's her story to share.
Her story.
But yeah, I can feel my broken open-heartedness right now, and the importance of that to me is it allows me to see and hold myself, others' pain, but in a way that I don't feel the need to carry it in the same way I once did, but that I can just be with it because I understand better my own.
You can step into the place of being able to stand shoulder to shoulder with someone else's story and the fullness of that story without turning it into a problem that you need to solve without taking the burden of the emotions. It is, in my view, the most profound expression of empathy. And I keep thinking back to you sitting at the table with that mic drop question that you put to the assembled council, where you, in Buddhism, we'd say, you gave them a pointing out instruction, which is analogous to a slap upside the head.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, what are we here to do?
There's additional arc to that story, but the thing that's come to mind for me that I had forgotten on this that relates to, a topic I wanted to touch on with you is one experience with my parents when I was younger. We were in Boston, I think, on family vacation. They loved taking us to major American cities. We never traveled internationally. We only went domestic cities for vacation. So we were in Boston, and we were having dinner at, a like clam chowder and seafood kind of place. And as we walked in, we saw an unhoused man outside, and I asked my mom about him. And she said, oh yeah, he doesn't have a home and he's probably hungry, and gave the explanation that she could for, let's call me 10 at the time. And we sat down to dinner, and at the end we had a bunch of food left over, which we put in a box, but we were staying in a hotel and we couldn't use it. And I don't know exactly what happened. The way I remember it was either I asked or my mom offered, hey, why don't we give this to that unhoused man? And we went out, and I was a very shy boy. I didn't like to interact with adults. I didn't like to ask for the library book I was looking for or whatever. But my mom made it a point to have me go give the food to the unhoused man. I remember walking over to him, very scared and tentative, and handing it to him, and then kind of running back to my parents and turning around and seeing him open it and begin to eat. That probably created the roots of compassion in a way that you could imagine doing the opposite. Stay away from him. He's dangerous. Don't go near him. And so I think a lot about to me, the ultimate role of leadership is of course for ourselves, but for our children, if we choose to be parents. I really take that as my biggest role in my life, is to be a good leader for my children, and a compassionate one, an empathetic one. And you talk some about your kids in the book, and especially Emma, your daughter, who really called you to a higher version of yourself as inspiration for the book. I guess my question here is, what might you know about being a father from your seat with 3 grown children that I might want to know from my seat with 2 young boys?
First, I want to respond a little bit to that story that you just shared. Your ancestors' movement to the safety of belonging has a deeper purpose, which is to see the human in the unhoused. And there is a connecting point. There is a through line that I would encourage you to lift up and teach your sons. And to the question, there's a lot I would offer. You sounded like you were particularly moved by the fact that my, as I often call her, fierce as daughter, who is unafraid to call to task those around her. This was a kid who, when she came to understand the meaning of the Bill of Rights, refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance in her school, and then lectured both her teacher and her principal that she had read the Bill of Rights, and she understood that she had the right not to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Or how she got into a fight with one of her high school teachers about the implicit privilege built into the SAT program and the SAT testing program. So she has always been a fierce warrior. I would say that both her mom and I have done a pretty good job of modeling, leaning into sharp edges, of allowing our children to call us to task for our inconsistencies, for our inevitable lack of inner and outer integrity. And sometimes it's been rude, but it has always drawn us closer.
It strikes me that could only be true because you allow it to be that way.
And to be fair, it's only true because both their mom and I allow it to be.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. My older son we say that he's just like me. It's like seeing a little mini personality of my own. And in a lot of ways, it's been very healing. I mean, becoming a father has been very healing for me. It's allowed me to reparent myself, to understand myself better. And I had a friend, her name's Sarah Kathleen Peck. I love her to death. I sent her a Marco Polo and said, he's a lot like me. And she responded, with a laugh and, a story. But then said at the end, she said, and remember, you have to leave room for the fact that he might not be just like you. And I needed that. I needed a friend to say that to me in a way that I could hear it, because I could absolutely see how assuming that would shape so much about how I would approach parenting him, and how having that one reframe creates so much more space for him to become whatever he's going to become. And so I'm just so interested in that kind of, it directly mirrors helping people in their careers as a leader and allowing them to become who they're going to become, embracing when they might need to leave you and go work somewhere else, and so many other things like that.
Well, the psychological term is separation and individuation. And I will tell you that the process, my youngest son just got married. I'll say that again because it's a mind. My youngest son just got married. He's the first of the three, but my youngest son has a wife. Okay. One of the biggest challenges, and your friend called you out on this, one of the biggest challenges is to allow them to separate and individuate and become their own person, and to not project either our pain or our own wishes onto them. But more importantly, to allow them the space to push back when they need to push back, and effectively say, that may have been true for you, but it's not true for me. Now, I'll give you another reframe that I think might be true. And I think you might want to hold on to this, because you have sons. And the tendency might be to equate their journey a little bit with your journey. I will warrant that they have a better father than you did. And I think that that's a really important thing to hold on to, because you are allowing yourself to ask yourself these questions. And men of the previous generation may not have allowed themselves to ask these questions, and so therefore suffered.
Yeah, I can receive that. I believe it to be true. And I'm very grateful for all the costs of that everyone before me paid so that I could.
That's right.
I'm very grateful for it. I want to talk, we've got about 20 minutes left. And let me say this. When I got into coaching, I had this internal struggle. I had this internal barrier I had to get over. I had been kind of coaching people on the side for 10 years on and off, just as like staying fresh and seeing other business scenarios. And I never could embrace it as a profession, because I had all these stories about what it means to be a coach and what the profession is and whether it's legitimate and blah, blah, blah. Largely because I've seen some coaches who have done some real harm in the world. But the thing that got me over the hump was realizing that Andy in particular had been in my life as maybe the third most important person in my life over the period of time when I grew out of my role as COO and into a period of unknown, and out of that into a coach. And that he was a reflection of a level of trust and belief in the entire Reboot family and your way of being, not just doing coaching, but your way of being, that I said, I don't need anything else. I have role models. And so it doesn't matter what the coaching profession is, because I know what great coaches look like.
That's sweet.
And so I hope you can receive that, first of all, because you are the leader of that organization. But I say all of that because I think you're one of the best coaches in the world and one of the best coaching organizations in the world. And so I thought we might do a little bit of a rapid fire through some coaching tools for listeners, because I'd love for folks to walk away with some stuff they can use for doing some of the same exploration that we've shared together here in our stories. So the first one we started with was red, yellow, green. We talked about that one a little bit already. But I thought the next one you might highlight, that anyone who listens to you will have heard at this point, but it's the three core questions about things that are and aren't being said. And I wonder if you might just share those and a little bit about them.
The three questions you're referring to are, what am I not saying that needs to be said? What am I saying that's not being heard? And what's being said that I'm not hearing? And the first question, the story behind that first question is shortly after, in a previous career, I was a venture capitalist. I was an investor. I had just gone into partnership. This was in 1996. I had just gone into partnership with Fred Wilson. And a few weeks after we announced the partnership, I was on the beach with my family and I was struck down by a terrible, terrible migraine. And it was so bad that I was hospitalized for a week and I went through a battery of tests, and the neurologist at the end said, damned if I know. We don't know what happened. I went into therapy afterwards, and my then psychoanalyst, Dr. Sayers, said to me, somewhat exasperated, what are you not saying that you need to say? And I said, what? And she said, what are you not saying that you need to say? And you need to say it so badly that you would give yourself a migraine. And I grew up with migraines. In other words, I grew up not saying the things that I needed to say. Remember, before I talked about the surprising expression of my depression from childhood. So that began a long endeavor of retraining my brain to say the things that I need to say. But as I began to work that, both as a leader, a CEO, and then later as a coach, I began to understand that there were the corollary secondary questions to that. And the truth is that a lot of what is being said that we don't hear, and a lot of what we say that is not being heard, stems in part because we're not necessarily using words. We're relying on actions. We're relying on what I say, our minds being read. You can see how these questions actually grow out of that radical self-inquiry process. Because just coming to grips with what I'm not saying that needs to be said, that can actually be transformative in many ways. When we sort of look at the corollaries to that, we realize that as a parent, as a life partner, as a leader, as someone who holds power, we have a responsibility to listen for what's being said, even if it's not being said with words.
Yeah, I hear that almost as it's our job to invite what needs to be said, to look for signs that things need to be said and invite it. Because I'm going to add this layer of meaning on it myself. We'll see if you agree. Especially as a leader of a company, there's a power dynamic at play that makes it much more difficult for everyone down the organization to say what needs to be said, even if they know what they want to be saying.
I completely agree with that. And let's not also lose sight of the fact that those who might identify as outside of a normative, dominant culture may not be saying what needs to be said for fear of their safety, because their belonging might be threatened if they name something that needs to be named.
So one of the tools I wanted to ask you about is getting real feedback as a leader is very hard. And I wonder what tools you found for getting effective, real feedback as a CEO or executive leading a team.
I think the challenge isn't the tool. The challenge is the culture. The challenge is what happens when someone says the unacceptable thing. What happens in an organization when someone checks in red? I remember I helped facilitate an offsite for an executive team, and we started off with a red, yellow, green check-in, and the CEO checked in as green. He was very green. And I sat there and I said, really? Because that's not the feeling I'm getting. And what was only acceptable was to check in as green. What I'm really, in a joking way, getting to is that a true culture of feedback is rooted in the safety of truth-telling.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the parenting thing you shared in some ways. Do
Exactly.
you allow it?
Do you allow the truth to come forward?
Mm-hmm.
Or even, if you go back to reunion for a moment, think about what I often talk about in the book, the negative space that secret keeping creates inside of our family structure, and the
Yeah.
devastating impact of not talking about this person or that person. In business organizations, there are dozens and dozens of examples of the things that's not safe to say.
So we're running out of time. I want to throw a couple of things out that people can kind of search for, maybe in the Reboot world or universe. Listening walks have been a wonderful tool for my own leadership and for connection and belonging in organizations I've led and been a part of. They can probably find something about those if they search your world. Retreats, your boot camps, and other retreats where, as I listen to your story over a number of interviews, and you both as interviewer and interviewee, I just hear this rich past of exposing yourself to new experiences over and over and over, each one adding something to your story and your ability to lead and coach. And then I want to offer a book that I got. I mean, my whole coaching bookshelf is basically recommendations from Reboot and Andy, but one of them is The Wild Edge of Sorrow.
Oh, yeah.
And in that, I found so many tools for accessing and processing grief that have become, and I continue to learn how to use, key tools for me for accessing it and being with it. So I speed through those so that I can ask you the couple of questions that I always close with. And then I'm going to read a poem to you at the end, or blessing, I should say, from a shared mentor via his books. The first question I have is, I read this line in a memoir last year called Deep Creek by an author named Pam Houston. And it's about buying a ranch in the high country of Colorado and that becoming her place for belonging. And in it, she's talking about a dinner that she had with two younger women at a university she was speaking at. And she's telling her life story, basically a lot of the pain she shared. And she sees a reaction in one of them. And this young woman leaves dinner and they're supposed to meet up again later. And she doesn't show up for a few hours. And there's this line in the book where she says she saw in that young woman the recognition of an unbearably beautiful future in front of her. And it was breaking her down, causing her to cry. And that phrase has stuck with me, an unbearably beautiful future. And I think so much of Reunion is about that. What if we imagine something unbearably beautiful? And I just wonder, when I offer that phrase, what future do you hope for that would be unbearably beautiful to you?
One in which our hearts are broken open and that we let the words of the Torah fall in. One in which we can let each other's stories of belonging fall in so that we can all hold each other.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for that. You said a thing earlier that I heard as a massive encouragement, which is that you are still becoming a coach. And I know that I will always be becoming a coach. I'll always be becoming a father, becoming a better human. And at the root of that, I wonder, from where you sit today, taking what I interpret as taking your seat as an elder, certainly an elder of mine that I appreciate and learn from. I wonder who you're becoming.
I think that having published now 2 books and having started a third, I'm becoming that which I had always wanted to be, which was a writer who manifests my elder wisdom through the power of words. I have this vision. I just turned 60, and I have this vision of spending the next 20 years marveling at how you all youngsters are flailing around and then welcoming you when you enter your elderhood.
It's really beautiful. I think it has been a great service, and it will be a great service to have your voice reach that many more people. That resonates deeply with me. I thought I might pull a Reboot move and read you a little something to close. And for all the viewers, they can see this is another gift from Reboot. It is a book of blessings called To Bless the Space Between Us by John O'Donohue, who you quote often in your writing and when you speak. And I thought that I would read for you a blessing for belonging to close our time together. For belonging, may you listen to your longing to be free. May the frames of your belonging be generous enough for your dreams. May you arise each day with the voice of blessing whispering in your heart. May you find a harmony between your soul and your life. May the sanctuary of your soul never become haunted. May you know the eternal longing that lives at the heart of time. May there be kindness in your gaze when you look within. May you never place walls between the light and yourself. May you allow the wild beauty of the invisible world to gather you, mind you, and embrace you in belonging.
Amen.
I think that you have been a great source of belonging for many people, great inspirer for people to claim their inherent sense of belonging and work to create it for others. And the number one thing I want you to know is I'm grateful for you.
Oh. Well, thank you for hearing my story as well as you have, both in this conversation, but across the years. Thank you for internalizing the work of my elders, that I am merely a vessel for, that I merely pass along, maybe with a little bit extra spice here and there. But the recipe that I pass along has been passed down to me. And may you be the coach that your descendants deserve.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I can receive that too. Jerry, I will shamelessly promote your books for you in my outro to this episode, but I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to share before we go, or anywhere you'd like to point people before we close.
I mean, you can find all things about us. Obviously, you'll have links and stuff like that. But I think that the main thing is, we are living in extraordinarily divided times. When I embarked on writing Reunion, I knew how painfully separated and divided we were. I did not imagine it would actually get worse. It is actually worse. And so my starkest wish is that we listen for the longing to belong in everyone around us, including those unhoused folks sitting outside your church.
Yeah. And my call to action to everyone listening is, that's what this show is for. First of all, to create a sense of belonging, safety, love between me and the guests, but also this community that we're building in the audience. And yeah, you belong here. And I hope that you'll go out and create belonging for others today. So thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.
All right, that wraps up episode 3 of Good Work with Barrett Brooks. That's me. I'm your host and the creator of this show. My friends at Podcast Royale produce the show for me, so if you love the way the audio sounds, make sure to show them some love. My guest today was Jerry Colonna. He's a mentor, a teacher, and a friend. You can find his work in many places around the web, but a few places to go first are pals.com or to your favorite place to get books, and search for his 2 books, Reboot and Reunion. Reboot is perfect if you're doing the inner work to become the leader you're capable of, and Reunion is great if you're trying to build communities, to create a sense of belonging within your organization, and to understand the different paths that people walk through life that might make their experience different from yours. You can find Jerry's firm, Reboot, at reboot.io. They have some incredible offerings, from executive coaching to leadership retreats with other founders and CEOs who are in the same seat as you, as well as self-paced courses and plenty of education and learning that's free. I recommend them wholeheartedly, even knowing that I'm an executive coach too. I would say I'm part of the Reboot lineage in that way. And so I would recommend that you check them out. And if they're best for you, that's awesome. Go work with them. I love them. You can also find Jerry on Twitter at Jerry Colonna, JerryColonna. And of course, there's a bunch of great links in the show notes for you to find everything right there. Now, I want to give you a little preview of my next guest. But before I do that, if you loved this episode of the show with Jerry, please hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. And if you're feeling really generous, I would love it if you'd leave a review as well. The reason I ask for reviews is that it helps the algorithm know which shows have audiences that care enough to leave a review, basically. It feeds the algorithm and helps more people find the show so that I can grow my audience. If you love the show, that's a way to continue supporting it, help me reach my goals as well. Now, my guest for episode 4 is someone I'm really excited about. Her name's Anne-Laure Lecoumphe. She's studying for her PhD at King's College in London. She's also the founder of Nest Labs. Nest Labs is a community of people and resources that are helping turn neuroscience into actionable advice that you can apply in your life every day. Anne-Laure talks about topics like mindful productivity, creativity, and a whole host of topics related to applied neuroscience, basically taking the science of how our brains work and using it to live better lives. And Laura and I have an incredible conversation from her cultural heritage and how that shapes her experience, all of our cultural heritage and how that shapes our experience, her work getting her PhD, how she balances that with her creative work, the community that she's building, and the vision she has for Nest Labs, and so much more awesome stuff in that episode. Be sure to subscribe or go ahead and download that episode now if it's already available. I think you're going to love it. Thanks so much for tuning in today. It's really deepest honor and pleasure to be able to make this show for you. I love you. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you on the next episode.